More than 60 years ago, President John F. Kennedy enacted Proclamation 3447, which imposed an embargo on all trade with Cuba in order to stop the growth of so-called Sino-Soviet communism. Lester D. Mallory, the Assistant Secretary of State, wrote in an April 1960 memo, "Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba." The goal of the Kennedy administration was clear: to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government of Cuba. The sanctions have since remained. Apparently, the US government thinks that if they keep sanctioning Cuba, it will eventually disappear from the map. They clearly haven't heard of Latin America's stubbornness. But now it's finally getting a taste of it. Hi and welcome to TFI Global Latin America, TFI Global's channel dedicated to the America in the Americas. I'm your host Shalini Tiwari. If you're watching us on YouTube, please subscribe and press the bell icon to get all the latest updates. If you're watching us on Facebook, do like, share and follow the page. Let's begin. The consequences of the US embargo on Cuba have been devastating. Cruise ships, cultural exchanges, and educational groups that used to power the main industry on the island are now outlawed. All remittances to Cuban families through Cuban companies and their affiliates are now prohibited, leaving millions of people destitute. The export of medical technology with US components is off limits, resulting in a persistent lack of basic medication. Even the internet is not available to Cubans, as they cannot use any of the popular communication platforms like Zoom, Skype, Microsoft Teams due to the embargo. In a nutshell, the US embargo has far-reaching effects on all aspects of life in Cuba. But the times of despair for Cuba may be coming to an end. Finally, Latin America is uniting against the sanctions on Cuba. Countries in the region are increasingly embracing the Caribbean nation as an ally and trading partner. Marcelo Ebrard, Mexico's foreign minister, has announced that the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has accepted an invitation to host a summit of progressive Latin American countries, which will involve Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel. Ebrard specified that the nations likely to be invited include Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Chile, and Honduras. Ebrard reiterated President AMLO's pledge to spearhead a global effort to terminate the US embargo against Cuba, advocating for this cause at forums like the G20, the Community of American and Caribbean States, and even the European Union. You know things are serious when Mexico is getting involved in the fight against US sanctions on Cuba. AMLO has called for the termination of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo that has been imposed on Cuba for over 60 years. In a recent meeting with Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, AMLO said, "As a sign of goodwill and that all the countries of the Americas are willing to join forces, I consider and express with respect that the US government should lift as soon as possible the unjust and inhumane blockade of the Cuban people." Not only Mexico, but Colombian Vice President Francia Marquez Mina has also reiterated the stance on the unjust sanctions on Cuba. The Colombian Vice President has called for Cuba to be taken off the list of countries that sponsor terrorism, citing their role as a mediator between Colombia and Venezuela. Francia said, "It's not fair that a country like Cuba, which has contributed so much to peace in Colombia, is part of the US list of countries that support terrorism. Today from Havana, I show my support for this island nation, so it is taken off said list." But wait, this isn't all. The summit of progressive Latin American countries is further going to oppose US sanctions on Cuba. Don't be surprised if they sign several trade deals with Cuba, negating the effects of US sanctions. The challenge to US sanctions on Cuba is part of a larger shift in Latin America's attitude towards the US. The region has become increasingly critical of US economic and foreign policy and has sought to increase its independence from Washington's influence. The challenge to US sanctions on Cuba is an important development in Latin America's relationship with the US. Latin American countries continue to embrace Cuba. In the future, the US long-standing policy of economic sanctions may become increasingly difficult to maintain. As tensions rise over US sanctions on Cuba, it's clear that Latin America is not afraid to take on the bully on the block.